بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I don't usually like to be crude, but this is something that only the men in this room are going to really understand and empathize with. Sorry, there are certain things, ladies, that you just never will. In the same way, there's certain things that we'll never be able to empathize with as well. That is, when you're playing sports and that ball comes to you at an angle you don't see it and you get hit in the crown jewels. Knocks you out completely, right? I mean, there's just no recovering from that whatsoever. And what happens, actually, the first time that takes place, is that you have a memory of it, right? That you feel. Now, the next time you watch a movie, some kind of slapstick movie or something, or some kind of comedy, and somebody gets hurt in that same way, every single man who's watching that, whether it's a cinema or wherever it is, they go, oh, right? It gets you every single time. Your body feels what that person goes through because the body has a memory of the trauma from the first time you experienced it. What's interesting is that men who have never had that experience do not react to that scene in the same way as men who do. In tests that have been done, the way that the body works is that the amygdala and the hippocampus, okay, in your brain, they release certain hormones which try and counteract that sensation of the pain. Now imagine you're a torture survivor, a trauma survivor, okay? Every single time that you give a testimony about the trauma that you went through, every single time that you talk about the solitary confinement, the torture, every single aspect of it, and I'm sorry that I have to be so crude, but this is the world that we live in. Whenever somebody who was anally raped talks about it, they talk about it, their sphincter closes as they speak. Why? Because their body had an experience of that. And so that comes back to them. And so that's why people like Sheikh Abdul Salam Zaif and so many survivors around the world, men, women, and children, these people are my heroes because they come out, those who speak, they come out and they talk about this at personal cost to themselves. We think of torture and arbitrary detention as being problematic in the time period it was in. But we don't think about the lasting effects it has, that for the rest of your life, you are being consistently tortured. That it doesn't stop the moment you're released. It stays with you. It becomes a normal part of your life. I've got friends who are former survivors who sit whichever room they're in, facing the door. They have to, because they're always worried about who's going to be coming through it. They live their whole lives with this fear of who's going to come through that door, who's going to burst through the door. In a normal restaurant environment, there's no reason why some security agencies are going to come in and rush and take him out. But they live like that. And so, it's important that we kind of place that into context. And it wasn't actually part of my talk. It just struck me as Sheikh Abdul Salam Zaif was speaking that, often we forget about it or we don't understand really what we're dealing with. The trauma exists at so many levels. The last British man to be released from Guantanamo, Shakir Ahmed, he just came back after 14 years. This is a man who had never met his youngest son, Faris. His son Faris was born after his kidnap. So we think once again that the difficulty in his life was Guantanamo. He'll tell you himself, that was one of the easiest times of my life. The greatest difficulty I'm feeling right now, the greatest challenge I've ever had is connecting with my children. I've never experienced anything more traumatic than this in my life. I spoke to one of our colleagues, Mazen Beg. This was 3 years after his release. I say to him, your son was born after you were detained, and so you didn't see him for the first 3 years of his life. How did you build that relationship? Like, how did you kind of grow to love him again? He goes, I still fake it till this day. This was 3 years after his release. Can you imagine having to fake love for your child because you haven't had those early years to build that relationship? Now, alhamdulillah, obviously he does, but it took him a long time to get there. So we have this conception of torture and trauma as being limited to the time period it takes place, and we don't take it forward from there. These people are released and that's it. And so part of the work that we collectively need to be doing is actually helping these people after they're released as well. And it's not just men in Guantanamo, right? It's people all over the world. The worst prisons are in Morocco, Syria, Egypt, so on and so forth. But the reason why Guantanamo is so particularly important is because it becomes a representation of what humans are capable of. Because everybody expects a higher standard from America. For those of us who studied some more of history, maybe not, that's not the case, but at least there's a perception in the world that America is supposed to be leading on this stuff, right? Even if you kill the Native American population of America. But look, at that aside, okay? So, when you think about, my apologies. Yeah, when you think about Guantanamo itself, I've gone to like the northeast corner of Kenya and met Somalis who've been interned for 17 years. You know what they say? When you ask them, what's it like being here? They say, it's like being in Guantanamo Bay. Are you serious? You've been here for 17 years, without charge, without any trial, in the worst conditions possible. It's 1,000 times worse than Guantanamo. But they themselves use Guantanamo as a reference point because they think that the world will understand by doing that. So it's important that we think about these things when we talk about this subject matter. Why is it that we pick on this prison more than, say, Bagram? Bagram's worse, much worse than Guantanamo. But we pick on Guantanamo because we want to have a focus for our campaigning that we can then carry through to then the other prisons around the world. If we deal with Guantanamo, we can start setting a standard for behavior for other prisons around the world. That's why we focus so heavily on that. So some of the, let me give you one example of the type of torture that exists. And I'll try and link it to another subject that I'm going to come to soon. Imagine, right, you walk into a room and the scene before you is this. There's a man who's being cuffed by his wrists, and his wrists are above his head. He's being hung from the ceiling, so his toes are only just barely touching the floor. He has nothing except some kind of nappy or diaper on. Okay, that's it. He's completely naked otherwise. And you quickly realize that this room isn't actually a room. It's a toilet. Okay? And the man is being suspended from there, and you can see the signs of the torture all over his body. He's being whipped with rubber cables on his feet, on his legs, on his back. With the feet, they do something called falaka, where they beat the soles with these rubber cables over and over and over again. But then when they stop that, they force the guy to run on his feet and pour cold water on it. There's a reason. They've got their torture down to an absolute science, okay? You pour the cold water on because it helps the circulation start up again so they feel the next round of the falaka, okay? Because if they do it for too long, they stop feeling the pain. So you have to pour the cold water on and you have to get them to run on the spot, okay? So this guy's hanging there. And you watch, an interrogator comes in, and he leans in and he says, you've missed 3 or 4 prayers already, but how are you going to pray? Because you've defecated all over yourself, you're inside a toilet, so how is it possible for you to pray without insulting Allah while you're doing that? You know it's impermissible. They've not only got the physiology of torture down, they've got the religion down as well. They have all of these anthropologists and cultural experts who come in and tell them every single detail of what will destroy them. Eric Saar, in his book, Inside the Wire, he was one of the interrogators who was in the initial rounds of interrogation at Guantanamo. Eric Saar, this is, like, first time I heard this was amazing for me. He says that I was watching an interrogation take place, and this woman, this female interrogator, she was getting really frustrated at this detainee. She was shouting at him, kicking his chair, slapping him, and saying, look, tell us what we need to know, so on and so forth. In the end, the detainee just looks at her as she gets close to his face and just spits in her face, and she kind of runs out, really angry. Eric Saar talks about the fact that she goes out, she goes to her Arabic translator, and she asks him, how do I break this guy? And he says, pretend to smear menstrual blood on his face, take him back to his cell, and turn off the water so he can't wash himself. He'll feel ritually impure and feel like, he can't pray, he can't worship God in any way, he can't take solace in his religion in any way, and that way you'll break him, right? So this is the environment that's being created by Guantanamo, where it's not only the body that's attacked, but it's the soul that's attacked at the same time as well. Another person that I'm representing right now in Guantanamo talks about how when he was in a prison in a black site, which I won't mention because I can't, he had an Arab man sitting in front of him, or at least what looked to be an Arab man, blowing into knots, reciting certain incantations. Okay, whether or not it's true in terms of the fact that the person who was doing this believed it could work, it was used as a method of torture to say, we're bringing in sorcerers to practice black magic on you. Okay, imagine what that does to your head. You're sitting there, you've been tortured for months on end, and all of a sudden there's this guy who's doing all of this stuff, right? So they know every single part of what harms the Muslim, what harms the soul, what harms the body, and they use all of that against you. They use your shame against you, your modesty, your humility. Every single part of your life is used against you in order to destroy you so that they can rebuild you. This is what torture is about. Torture is about destroying the body, destroying the mind, destroying the soul, so that the person can be rebuilt in order to be compliant. That is how torture works. So this is Guantanamo Bay. This is American and CIA policy in relation to all the black sites. It's not just, the fact that the men were abused and tortured a little bit, slapped around, and even waterboarded. It's so much more than that. So how does this feed into my next subject, which, hopefully I'll try and get through as quickly as possible because you've all been very patient with us. It feeds in because religion, in many ways, as part of the war on terror, sits at the centerpiece of so many of their calculations in relation to how to deal with the problem of Muslims. We're problematized as an entire community, right? We've been made into a suspect community. And so the question then becomes, how do you deal with that suspect community? How do you, in the same way as you do it to the body as a community, how do you break it down so you can rebuild it in the image that you like? And this is where we come to what's known as the countering violent extremism policy. In the UK, we call it the PREVENT strategy. And the whole purpose of this, the reason why it was invented, is after 9/11 and 7/7 in the UK, what the government said was that, look, we shouldn't just be focusing on catching terrorists. What we need to do is prevent terrorists from being formed in the first place. So initially in 2007, the whole idea was, we'll do this by countering or preventing violent extremism. So the emphasis at that stage was still on violence. It wasn't on anything else. They were like, okay, look, we need to deal with this problem of violence. So we need to scrutinize certain groups who maybe have affiliations to violent tendencies. But the problem with that was that they went too far, right? So they started calling out every single pro-Palestine organization for, being anti-Semitic and supporting Hamas or Hezbollah and so on and so forth. So what was in the realm previously of legitimate politics of dissent from UK government policy became part of a wider narrative of the war on terror. Okay, that this is all part of this kind of nebulous structure of violence and extremism. Okay? See how they then bring in other conflicts. So Chechnya got brought in as well. Bosnia from before got brought in as well. Kashmir, Sudan, Somalia, all of these things got dragged in. They're localized conflicts, albeit the Ummah as a large has kind of some kind of desire to help, usually with Palestine more than Africa, because let's face it, everybody, the reality is most Muslims don't give a damn about black people. Okay, sorry, but we just have to call out our own racism as it is. Okay, we do have a problem with that. It's part of the reason why we're forming Cage Africa. We want a base here so that we don't forget about what's happening on this continent. It's so important. So anyway, going back to my topic, the government realized that it's failing, okay? The next government was coming in and they said all the right things. We were amazed. A conservative government saying prevent strategy has failed, it's disenfranchising communities, it's got the wrong emphasis, we're going to do an entire review, and hopefully the next iteration will be better. I mean, I don't know why we are ever hopeful with any of these people, because the next iteration was worse. They said instead of preventing violent extremism, we need to prevent extremism itself. So unfortunately, they did that. They put a whole new policy together, this entire strategy, and they defined extremism in the following ways. They said extremism is vocal or active opposition to British values. And I don't just mean fish and chips, okay? Which is about the only thing I can think of which is probably a British value, right? But they defined British values as what? They said it was democracy, it was, ironically, the rule of law, the one thing they systematically destroyed since 9/11, due process, equality, and calling for the death of the armed services, okay? So that last one aside, this kind of vague language about being in opposition to these British values, I mean, how do you even go about judging that? Is, for example, speaking against the wrongs and the ills of the banking sector, the usurious system, going against British values? They would say yes. So that's where it began, but then it took on another face as well. This is especially after the murder of Lee Rigby. I don't know if you know, but there was a British soldier who had his head chopped off by a Muslim man in the UK. So after that, they came up with another definition. This one specifically focusing on Islamist extremism. Now, how did they define Islamist extremism? They said anybody who believes in an Islamic polity, like, for example, a khilafah, okay, but it goes wider than that. Anybody who believes in, having a political sense of establishing an Islamic system. Okay, once again, this is about the politics of dissent. Okay, anybody who believes in the primacy of Sharia, okay, that the Sharia law has a place above Western law. Which is ironic, right? Because David Cameron goes ad nauseum on about the evils of Sharia law, this backwards Sharia law, this medieval Sharia law. But as soon as you talk about Sukuk bonds, he's like, was very, very proud of having £200 million investment in Sukuk bonds, Sharia compliant Sukuk bonds. Hold on, that same Sharia that you were insulting just a week ago, you're saying you're so proud of it now. Neoliberalism, people. If it's to do with money, they're totally fine with it, no matter how Sharia compliant it is. So the halal fashion industry, the halal food industry, the halal car industry, whatever you want to call it, right? The finance industry, as long as it's wealth generating and it's halal and it's Sharia compliant, no matter how much you have to bend the Sharia to get there, that's okay. But as soon as that Sharia teaches you that you need a politics of dissent from this prevailing neoliberal model of the way that the world is supposed to exist, that's when it becomes completely unacceptable. And that's when you become an extremist. What else does the Islamist extremism strategy say? They also specifically mention 3 scholars, but they do say there are many more who they don't name. They say that anybody who reads and follows the work of Sayyid Qutb, Abul Ala Maududi, and Hassan al-Banna, you are an Islamist extremist. Okay? Now, some of you say that, look, these guys have some problems in their thinking and so on and so forth, and there's some problematic groups that came out of them. Okay? Let's talk about that a little bit. Lawrence Wright wrote a book called The Looming Tower straight after 9/11. And in it, he kind of presented for the first time this notion of Sayyid Qutb's thinking, radicalizing Abdullah Azzam, who is the kind of proto-Afghan foreign fighter, and then who radicalized Osama bin Laden. So they've taken that and they've built their entire theory of terrorism and radicalization around what for them is the golden chain of terrorism. How do they come to these conclusions and how do they use them? So for example, in terrorism trials in the UK, they say, look, you've got all these terrorism plots and 70% of these alleged terrorists or convicted terrorists had these books on their shelves. So it shows a high level of correlation, right, between reading this stuff and becoming a terrorist. Except they're using the wrong data set purposely. The data set you want to use is every single person who's ever read any of Sayyid Qutb's works since the 1960s, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people here, by the way, yeah, to the present day, and then looking at the number of acts of political violence that stem from that. And conversely, also looking at the number of people who went down another path. Rashid al-Ghanouchi, for example, from the Ennahda party, he's built his whole ideology of Islamic secular liberalism out of his radicalization by Sayyid Qutb. He says that my entire thinking comes out of Sayyid Qutb, right? So, he's influenced so many different movements around the world, but apparently, if you read his stuff, it makes you an Islamist extremist. Now, how does this affect us in a practical way? And this is the rub, right? Because we're talking about soft policy, but it intersects with hard policy. It intersects with hard policy how? The Home Secretary, what I'll do is I'll run you through something. You're at your home, right? For those of you who have children, you might be able to empathize with this more. You're at your home, somebody knocks on your door, or barges your door through, actually, which is often the case. Maybe your wife isn't in her hijab, or you're not dressed appropriately, or whatever else. They don't care. Run in, okay, they raid the whole place, your children are screaming, your wife's screaming, you're screaming, because they've got your head like literally pinned into the floor. And then you're handed a piece of paper while you're in your cuffs. And this piece of paper says that the Home Secretary has made a decision to remove your children from you because we believe you to be an Islamist extremist. So social services come in, they take your children away. Counterterrorism police have you held off. Nobody's arresting anybody here. It's just an arbitrary decision of the Home Secretary. You can appeal this, okay? UK, it's the land of due process and the rule of law. You're allowed to appeal these decisions. So you go to the court, a special court called the SIAC Court. It's the Special Immigrations Appeals Commission. And you go to the judge and you say to the judge, Judge, there's a mistake here. I'd like to appeal this decision. The judge says, absolutely. You're more than entitled to. However, the government will present its evidence in secret. You are not permitted to see this evidence against you. Neither is your lawyer permitted to see this evidence against you. The government, when they present their evidence, you are excluded from the room entirely. You are, however, remember, land of due process and the rule of law, father of democracy. Okay, you guys wouldn't have it without us, yeah? Okay, John Locke. You're given a special advocate. The special advocate comes to you and says, okay, tell me about everything in your life ever. So if you're 60, it's far more problematic than if you're 24, right? Because I have to know as much information as I can, because once the evidence starts being given, I can't talk to you again. Once I hear the evidence, I can't refer back to you to ask you whether or not they're correct in saying this or they're correct in saying that. You have one shot to speak to this special advocate, and after that, it's over. They have to represent your interests without any involvement from you. So you're praying that you get your kids back in this period. By the way, we're dealing with 8 cases right now where this has taken place. Okay? This is happening right now in the UK. Rule of law, transparency and accountability. This is the ethos of Cage. This is the very soul of what we do. And it is being decimated. So what else can they do to you with these arbitrary orders? They can remove your passport. They can bar you from coming back into the country. So Rabani and I are quite right now hoping that we'll be allowed back in. They can remove your citizenship from you. And what I mean by removing your citizenship, it's not that you've got a citizenship elsewhere. Okay? It's not that you've already are a dual national of another country. It's if ancestrally you are capable of claiming citizenship in another part of the world somewhere. If they can prove to themselves that 6 generations ago you had a family member in India, then they will remove your citizenship from you because you're capable somehow of going back there and claiming citizenship. So this is part of it all. Sorry, you can also be put under house arrest, and there's many other orders as well, deportation orders. But with all of them, you have to go to this special court. So this is the UK right now, okay? And we've got this whole movement around countering violent extremism. And the big problem that we have is that people are so scared, they're so terrified right now of Muslims, of immigration, of black people, that we've just given up our rights completely. Completely. Because there is no empirical evidence in any of this. Anywhere, at any point. It's completely empirically unsound. The government said, we need to train all of our public sector workers in spotting the signs of radicalization. So last year they brought in something known as the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act. Okay, it's a new piece of legislation which makes it mandatory by statute for every single doctor, teacher, nurse, childminder, anybody who's in the public sector, by statute, has to inform on their patient or the child under their care or the university student if they spot signs of radicalization. How do these teachers and doctors and nurses taught? They're given a 3-hour training session where they're taught about these 22 factors. What do these factors include, right? Sheikh Yassin Dutton's here. So you, if you were in the UK, would have to implement this if you were in a university right now. You would have to say, you would have to look at whether or not your students were feeling a sense of grievance. If they were going through a transitory phase of life, okay? If they, I'm trying to think what the other ones are. They like excitement and adventure. Or my personal favorite, if they have a desire for moral or political change, right? So these are the 22 factors. Now, as any good researcher, once you see the government say, we've got these 22 factors, you think to yourself, well, how did you come to those 22 factors? So I go off and I start researching this, and I'm looking and looking and looking. I can't find anything. Reading a random book on prison radicalization one day, and I see something called the ERG 22+. And the book refers to this and says, a group of psychiatrists came together and they came up with these 22 factors of radicalization. So I said, great, look at the footnotes. It says Ministry of Justice document. It's the Ministry of Justice document, it should be available. Search the whole of the internet, not a single reference. On the Ministry of Justice website, not a single reference. Go to the British Archives, not a single reference. Literally pulling the follicles, the last few follicles of my hair out, yeah? But a few down here that I can start pulling as well. Nothing. So then we contact the government directly. The government says, national security. We can't release this. It's a scientific paper, apparently, produced by psychiatrists. How is it possible that you can't release the study? So we contact, as Cage, the Royal College of Psychiatry and ask them, do you guys know anything about this? They said, we haven't heard of this thing. What the hell are you talking about? We want to know, where is the peer review? It's a science, for God's sake. Every single science has to be peer reviewed. They've formed government policy in relation to specifically the Muslim community, although they would say the right wing as well. But even if we'd accept it's for the right wing as well, you've formed an entire policy out of this. Where is the science? Where is the challenge to the science? Nowhere. And so this is the world that we live in. You know, it is in many ways a Stasi science. Okay, if any of you are familiar with the history of the Stasi, you know that they did very similar things like this. So this is where we're at. And what is the ultimate manifestation of this? You have a 4-year-old, a case that we've been dealing with in the UK, who is in class and he's tasked with writing about what you did, drawing about what you did last night. The 4-year-old is drawing this really lovely picture of his dad with this long stick in his hand. And the teacher says, "Oh, this is nice. What is it?" And the child says, "Kukaba." Okay? It's a 4-year-old. Barely pronounce something that's more than 2 syllables long. And the teacher said, "What? A cooker bomb?" A cooker bomb. She informs the local prevent officials called counterterrorism police. Counterterrorism officers turn up at the parents' house and say, "Your child is being radicalized, you're involved with terrorism activity, where is this cooker bomb in your house? The house is raided, everybody is upset, the parents are told that we could take your child away from you." This is the environment. Just in this last year alone, we've been working on almost 200 cases of similar types of things. Children, 9-year-old children being taken out of their classroom and asked, "What is your opinion on Palestine and Israel?" It's amazing how often Palestine and Israel come up as a question about extremism. It's amazing, in fact. You know, when we talk about intersectionality, there is, you know, from Cage's work, what we've seen is that actually all of those groups working on Palestine have to be working with the groups that are dealing with the war on terror. It's a must, because the way that they're trying to stop Palestine activism is by linking it to the war on terror itself. So we need this intersectionality between us. Those who are working on all the opposite sides have to come together. In fact, I would say go as far as the Black Rights Movement in America, you know, everything that's going on in Ferguson, so on and so forth. All of these movements have to understand that national security policy ends up affecting all movements because it's about dissent. Okay, they don't want people to dissent from prevailing narratives about how they see the world, how they want the world to exist and to be constructed. And so, you know, this is where we are in the UK. You know, as a kind of a more positive note, you know, it also gives us something to work towards, inshallah. You know, we can come together, we can bring these issues together. There's so much experience with activism in other sectors that maybe those of us who've been working on the war on terror aren't aware of, that we haven't been pushing, okay? And so what we are hoping for is that we can come together. Now I want to leave you guys with one thing before Tahira wraps up, and maybe we can have time for a bit of Q&A. Cage's position, and what we teach all of our staff and our interns, is that we owe nobody, or nobody, sorry, the opposite round. Nobody owes us anything by doing this work. The survivors don't owe us anything. Society doesn't owe us anything. Because, I mean, for us, especially those of us who are Muslim, we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could replace us with anybody, right? It's a privilege to do this work. And part of that privilege means that you don't get to choose who you work with and who you don't work with, providing they are, you know, following a similar understanding of what the problem is. You have to work with partners, even partners that we might disagree with, because that is how we will come together to work against something that's a bigger structure. You know, once again, using Islamic, I know many of you aren't Muslims in this room, but you know, I've been talking a little bit about a verse in Surah Qasas in the Quran, and explains how Pharaoh decimates the Jews, okay, of Egypt when he's in control. And the verse describes his methodology. It says that Pharaoh splits the whole of Egyptian society into small parts, and after he's completed that process, he starts enslaving the women and killing the children. But there's a precondition to that oppression. You have to split the society into small sections, the classic divide and rule. You know, the British obviously were reading from Pharaoh's manual when they were coming up with all of their colonialism around the world, right? But this is the reality, that if we understand how empire works and how oppression works, that it requires, you know, the atomization of society and our activism, then the panacea to that has to be that we come together, even where we may have disagreements with one another. That has to be the solution to bringing about effective change against, you know, oppressive structures, oppressive power structures. And so I hope and pray that, inshallah, we can all come together. I mean, those of us coming from Cage London are outsiders, but the reason why we've got an Africa office is that people with local knowledge, local understanding, can work with our team over here to not only work locally for the African continent, but actually then intersect with us in London and say, actually, we can build, we can mobilize an entire movement to work against this. I'm really sorry that I spoke for much longer than I had intended to, but I hope that inshallah there was some benefit in some of my words, and I ask you to forgive me for anything that I said that was incorrect. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We got a question up there already. Are you happy for question and answer stuff? I have to ask the chair, otherwise the chair's going to like sort me out and I'll be suffering from my own trauma, and then you guys will have to campaign for me. There'll be a free Aslm Qureshi website. Please, yeah. Thank you.
In your first part of your talk, you spoke a lot about men who were detained in Guantanamo Bay and the abuses that they had to endure there. I was just wondering, are women ever detained in Guantanamo Bay?
Mm-hmm.
And if yes, what are some of the torture mechanisms used against women?
Thank you for your question. I mean, absolutely, it's an important one. Well, from what we know, fortunately from what we know, no women were ever detained at no Muslim women as part of the war on terror detained at Guantanamo Bay. It's important to recognize that there's plenty of detainees that predate the Muslims who were sent there, that come from, you know, other communities like Haitians and so on and so forth, right? They're not treated in a similar way, but they're interned there and they are treated extremely badly. And there are women who are detained as part of that. But Cage's remit's the war on terror, so if we kind of restrict it to that, then as far as we know, no woman was ever taken there. But there are plenty of women around the world who are detained as part of the war on terror. One woman that I went to see not too long ago, Aslm, who was detained in Morocco. When her family left Pakistan after the war on terror began, they moved to Saudi Arabia. Her husband and her youngest son were killed in a Saudi counter-terrorism operation. She was arrested with her older son, and they were kept in detention in Saudi Arabia for about 3 months. They weren't treated that badly. I mean, unfortunately, things become relative, you know, but they were treated badly. They get put on a rendition flight to Morocco. She hasn't been in Morocco in decades. She's barely from there. But they decide, ad hoc, that we think you're a Moroccan, so you're going there. Aslm, when she arrives in Morocco, she's detained for 9 months with her son, and they're kept in a cell together. What the Moroccan authorities do is that they regularly interrogate them. They live in 24-hour lights, with the AC in the winter put down to its coldest and in the summer put up to its hottest. Okay, her older son, he was only 10 at the time. This goes on for 9 months, you know. They're abused during that period, they're constantly interrogated. But the son is treated well. Every single time he's interrogated, okay, he's treated very well during the interrogation. And he's being tortured, right, with this 24-hour lights, no sunlight ever, solitary confinement, or just in close confinement with his mother. They don't interact with other people except for the guards. The guards end up convincing the son that the reason for his detention is the mother. He tries to kill his mother in her sleep one night. Okay? Even when I met them, the extent of trauma between mother and son was probably the most difficult and extreme thing that I've ever seen in my life. Like, I'll be honest with you, that's the hardest testimony I've ever taken. And I've met hundreds of trauma survivors. So, Sister, unfortunately, it happens a great deal. We know about Sister Afia Siddiqui. We know some of her story. We still don't know the whole truth. It was actually, Afia's case was the very first case that I ever worked on. In 2004, when I joined Cage, the first case profile that I investigated was hers. At the time, we didn't really know much. And still now, I would say there's very little that we know. But it's an important case and one that, you know, we should keep on raising and highlighting. So, Jazakumullah khair for your question. Yes, brother, please.
Just the way you explain the anti-terror laws in the UK, they get an authorization from the Home Secretary and they go in and they invade the house, take the kids. assuming that a lot of these anti-terror laws are totally dismantling the separation of the judiciary and the government and all those sorts of things. Is that the work of Cage to have activism against those sort of things, if I understand you correctly?
Yeah, sure, thank you. So Cage's entire principle is that we believe that all counter-terrorism legislation is unnecessary, and I would go as far as to say immoral. Okay, we have a criminal justice system that is able to deal with violent crime. If you look at every single case of far-right terrorism, for want of a better term, or far-right political violence, which I prefer as a term, in the UK, even where they have stacks of explosives and the largest cache of firearms and exact pinpointed mosques that they were going to attack, they're not prosecuted under any terrorism laws. They're prosecuted under the Fire and Explosives Act. Okay? Only, generally speaking, Muslims are prosecuted under terrorism laws. In cases in the early days of the war on terror, like, for example, the fertilizer bomb plot, where they hadn't instituted that strength of terrorism laws yet, Cage didn't make any comment on those cases because the police did their investigation work. They found these guys with stacks of liquid fertilizer. It was quite clear that they were going to bomb the Ministry of Sound plot. They had a trial. They were charged in the Fire Explosives Act, and they were convicted. And you know what we said? We've got nothing to add here. There was no due process element missing, no rule of law issue. You use the criminal justice system. It's fine. That's why when you look for Cage's press releases and statements, you won't find anything, because we work where the rule of law is missing. And we believe, as a matter of principle and morality, counterterrorism laws are destructive because they otherize, they create a suspect community. And I mean, if anybody can understand that, it's the South African community who had all forms of national security legislation during the apartheid era. So I hope that helps to answer your question. Yes, Chef, please. Yes, that's right. The child said cucumber, and the teacher heard cooker bomb. So, I mean, even if you said, Ayub here is a 4-year-old, yeah? If you said to Ayub cooker bomb, what does a cooker bomb mean? Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought, right? You know, he's got no idea. Okay, another 4-year-old I met, Hafsa Saleh Ali, in Nairobi in 2007. I interviewed her, 4-year-old child, little Kenyan girl, really sweet, sweet child, detained for 1 month, without any charge or trial, separated from her mother, was taken care of by random men and women in this joint prison, okay, no mattress, no blanket, in the cold Nairobi nights, okay? Why? Because they alleged her father was a terrorist. They interrogated this 4-year-old about what she knows, okay? This girl was so traumatized that every single time she saw a black man after her release wearing a uniform, even if he was just a cleaner in the street, she'd soil herself because of how traumatized she was from that experience. These are 4-year-old children. Ayub, you have a question?
Yeah. How can children help Cage?
Oh, mashallah. They asked how children can help Cage. Yeah? By growing up and studying law and politics and human rights and taking the establishment on in every way that we can. Jazakallah khair.
Studying all of these laws, how does Amnesty International fit in the other known human rights organizations? Basically, how do they, what is their standpoint pertaining this, or how do they view Cage even itself, or pertaining to the laws itself?
Look, we work with a number of organizations around the world, Amnesty included. You know, they have a view on what human rights looks like and who deserves human rights and who doesn't, and the issues that they would campaign over and the issues that they don't. You know, the reason why Cage exists is because we feel that there is a double standard sometimes by some organizations, without specifically going to who, as to who is deserving of human rights. And, you know, as far as Cage is concerned, our remit is very narrow. Whoever it is, whether they're Sunni or Shia or whatever, okay, or non-Muslim. I've dealt with Christian grandmothers who have been detained as part of the war on terror. Our remit is war on terror policy. I mean, it's such a small organization, but we feel that because the war on terror intersects and tries to undermine so many movements around the world, you know, movements that are involved in political dissent, in activism, that if we fight against counterterrorism policy worldwide within this war on terror, what we do actually is that we end up, inshallah, helping so many other organizations. So when the finances or the accounts of Palestine organizations are shut down, by campaigning against the policy that allowed for that process to take place, inshallah, we feel that we're making a contribution to then the Palestinian cause as well. So we see our role as being kind of almost like a defender for many of the other you know, kind of organizations out there. We recently took a case against the Charity Commission in the UK who were trying to undermine our work by going after some of our funders. In fact, our bank accounts have been closed for 2 years. Okay, so you know, us taking the Charity Commission to court made no difference to us. So even if we won or lost the case, those funders still couldn't give us any money because our accounts were closed. But the reason we took them to court, one of the many reasons we took them to court, was that there were a whole group of Muslim organizations that were being affected by this policy. And we said that to ourselves that, oh no, sorry, not even just Muslim organizations, even non-Muslim organizations were being affected by this policy. People who were doing campaigning work, dissenting against the government, you know, and their foreign policy and their economic policy and so on and so forth. So we took the Charity Commission to court to defend them, because we felt like if we allow them to just keep on carrying on in the way they are, then all these other organizations are going to be affected. So we have to take principled stances in everything that we do. So I hope that answers. Yes, please. Look, Ira, you're going to have to just like control this, because I'm just going to keep on talking until these guys fall off.
Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you for attending.
It was very informative. I wanted to ask because I understand that this space is primarily for the Muslim community and you advocating for them in the war against terrorism.
Yeah.
But my assumption with you opening an office, you know, here in Africa, a cage office here in Africa, is that you are trying to build allyship between people of different ethnicities and people of different races.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, what you do find, especially in the context of what's been happening very recently here in South Africa with Fees Must Fall, is that you have an underrepresentation of the Muslim community, which is something I've observed personally.
Sorry, in which issues?
Sorry?
Just generally underrepresentation.
Yeah, there's an underrepresentation. As in, I feel as though we don't hear the Muslim narrative as much as we hear the black narrative.
Right.
So I wanted to ask, in terms of bridging that gap and building that allyship, how would you propose that we offer support as people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds?
Would you mind if I just asked you about why you think there's that underrepresentation first?
I think there's an underrepresentation because I think there might be a bit of fear in terms of speaking out. I think there's a hierarchy of struggle, personally. I think that, you know, you might find that black people find that their struggle is of more importance than struggles that are experienced by people of other races and other ethnicities. Yeah. So I think that's a big problem that also needs to be addressed.
Right. Okay, so I mean, I mentioned the word intersectionality, and I'm a very, very big believer in this. You know, we have to come together on a variety of issues. There may be some issues where maybe we can't come together, but if we think of power as being structural and racism as being structural, you know, then we start to have a better sense of what it is that we're fighting. Because when power is centralized, right, without checks and balances, then it affects a whole range of groups. And what we have, at least in the Western world in particular, and I don't know to what extent it exists in South Africa here, is what Gayatri Spivak called epistemic violence, right? So we have all of these issues that we're dealing with, but the narrative is taken away from us because the narrative is being owned by our detractors. They say you can talk about racism, but you can only talk about racism to the extent that we're comfortable with you talking about racism, right? Or you can talk about the war on terror, but only to the extent that we're comfortable with you talking about the war on terror. So this is the epistemic violence that actually we're not allowed, we're not permitted to own our narrative because of the fear factor. And that is crucial. Like as not just Muslim people, as people who are hopefully right-minded and conscientious, you know, in terms of social justice issues, we have to build those alliances, because we're not taking on the issue actually, we're taking on what power means and how power is held to account. And I think if we think along those lines, rather than simply, you know, this is about Palestine, or this is about roads must fall, which I heavily support, by the way, you know, then that is then the way that we can get together. But if we keep our thinking narrow and limited to the specific issue, then we'll never be able to conceive of a wider activism. Now, how you guys get together, I'm an outsider. It's not for me to say. It's all of these brilliant people who have turned up today who are hopefully going to come up to you and say, this is how we work together. Tahira, who's based in Cape Town here, she's our representative for Cage Africa. She's full-time in this position. You know, she's the one who hopefully you guys are all going to get to know, get involved with, and you know, you're going to talk about, okay, you guys are dealing with this issue, we're dealing with this issue, how do we come together to actually, you know, make it a wider movement? So I hope that kind of answers it a little bit. I know I didn't give you an exact answer, but really I think it's up to you guys. And I'm an outsider. I feel strangely weird speaking to you about this stuff in the first place, because I think there should be somebody from South Africa doing it. Thank you very much, everybody. Again, you know, I really, really, you know, appreciate the fact that you gave us so much of your time and you listened so intently. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. 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 Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.